Welcome to the 383rd meeting of the New York Comics and Picture-story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series on comics, animation, illustration, and other text image work. It's funded in part by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation. Our guests tonight are K.A. Ryan and Gary Groth. K.A. Ryan is a teacher and historian. Some of his writing includes information on Burne Hogarth for Oxford's American National Biography, and he's calling in from Vermont. And Gary Groth is the editor-in-chief of a comics journal and a co-founder of Fantagraphic Books and the founder of the Harvey Awards. And he's calling in from Seattle. So thank you both for being here. It's a fascinating subject, the Blacklist and Burne Hogarth. And I think I'm really looking forward to it. So take it away, K.A.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. Also thank Gary for being kind enough to sit in with us and share his considerable experience, not just with Hogarth, but with comics and culture. I'm going to try to keep this moving because I got a little bit to cover here, but I must mention a couple of comic scholars who left us this past year. I was fortunate enough to know both of these men, and without their work, my studies would have been a much harder slog. In the early part of January, where are we? David Kunzel died. He worked out of UCLA, and I thought him the finest comics historian of any who've toiled in academia. It was Kunzel who gave Tupfer his due, Rudolf Tupfer. These are some of his books. He was also the translator of this book, How to Read Donald Duck. In December of 2022, Maurice Horn died in New York, where he had lived for many years since immigrating from France in the 1950s. His work was a catalyst for all modern comic scholarship. You can learn more about both of these guys at the Fantagraphics website. It's Maurice Horn that leads us into our subject, Burne Hogarth. It was Maurice Horn, along with other French comic scholars, who came to America in the mid-60s. They approached Hogarth about his work and their desire to exhibit that work in Paris. That meeting resulted in a group show in 1965, and then a Hogarth solo show in 1966. Now I'm going to give some background on Hogarth. He was born Bernard Spinoza Ginsburg, Christmas Day, 1911, on Chicago's Jewish West Side. His parents were immigrants from what is now Poland, but at that time was part of the Russian Empire. His father, Max Ginsburg, was born in Pinsk. At that time, it was part of the Jewish Pale, where all the Jews under that repressive regime were required to live. Max was a woodworker already married with a daughter when the failed Russian Revolution of 1905 ended in a brutal repression and the continuing anti-Jewish pogroms by the Tsarist government. Max was part of an enormous exodus in 1906. Alone, he made his way by ship to London, then to Canada, and finally to Chicago via Detroit. Chicago at that time had the second largest Jewish community in America. Max likely heard of the recent earthquake and fire in San Francisco. So he went west and worked in the rebuilding of that city for a couple of years, earning enough to bring his wife and daughter to Chicago, where they reunited in 1908. In 1909, a son, Harvey, was born, and their last child, Bernard, and that's the baby there, was born in 1911. That's Burne Hogarth. The young Hogarth liked to draw, probably in part because he liked watching his father making furniture designs. And when he asked what to draw, his father gave him the comics pages. Early favorites were Little Nemo and the Brownies and the Gumps and Luther Bradley's editorial work. While Burne was at von Humboldt Elementary, his father enrolled him at the Art Institute of Chicago in the Saturday classes for kids in 1924. Hogarth didn't much care for the rigid approach, but he did make use of the museum, and especially the Institute Library, where he had access to original prints from masters like Rembrandt and Hiroshige. A couple of years later, Hogarth started taking classes up the street at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts, where cartooning was taught. There he met a guy named Sal Bostwick, a fellow student and a working cartoonist. Sal Bostwick introduced him to Nick Nichols, a cartoonist editor working for the Associated Editors Syndicate. That's Nick Nichols standing in the back there, along with Cary Orr, the great cartoonist. And on the far right, there's Frank King, who did Gasoline Alley. Those guys would visit the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts and look at the students' work. Nichols put Hogarth to work as an assistant, cleaning up around the studio and eventually assisting on panel illustrations like The Sportiest Act I Ever Saw. There's one of them right there. It's probably Hogarth doing the finishes on it. While still in high school, Hogarth met and began study with Todros Geller, the best known of Chicago's Jewish illustrators. His time in Geller's studio had a lasting influence on Hogarth. That's some of Geller's work. The faces in the trees that you see in some of Geller's work for some Jewish children's books. 50 years later, Hogarth would revisit some of that in Jungle Tales, and in these pages where you see those same types of faces in the tree bark. Also, at about that same time in the late 70s, Hogarth dedicated his book, Drawing Dynamic Hands, to Geller. Also in 1928, Hogarth won one of the newspaper Draw Me contests that were held by the Federal School in Minneapolis. Later, they were known as the Art Instruction Schools. He was awarded a gratis scholarship for his drawing, and this was the one he won it with. Along with a drawing table was part of the prize that you would get. He took their correspondence for a little over a year. Hogarth graduated from Thule High School in under 4 years, receiving his diploma in February 1929. He was the vice president of his class, and he worked on the school annual. These are a couple of the pieces he did for it. It was also the first time he would start using the name Hogarth, probably because he was a big fan of William Hogarth. These are a couple other pieces he did for the senior annual. Incidentally, a young freshman who was entering in 1929 was the budding writer Saul Bellow. Through his Associated Editors contacts, Hogarth met J.W. Clattman in 1930. Clattman was a medical doctor and a part-time writer working on serialized stories in the Master Barber magazine. There, Hogarth had free rein to do as he liked. So he was allowed to do all kinds of illustrations for these serialized stories, mostly dramas and crime dramas and stuff like that. These are some of the pieces. He would do tail pieces that were small ones, headers, sometimes full-page illustrations like that. There's a double-page spread he got to do there. This is from 1931. It was also the era of Prohibition and Capone in Chicago. Also in 1930, Hogarth illustrated a feature called Famous Churches of the World. There's a couple of them. In 1931, he did some work for the Chicagoan magazine, a kind of New Yorker of the Midwest. There's a little piece he did in there. In 1932, Hogarth joined a new Chicago syndicate called Bonnet Brown with a humor panel called Ivy Hem and Haw. And that's it on the far left. It's a single panel illustration of a character Hogarth referred to as a biddy making comments on daily goings on. That work appeared alongside another newcomer, V.T. Hamlin and Alley Oop. This is where it first appeared. By 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt had the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, later the WPA, running, and Hogarth was hired by the Emergency Education Program to teach cartooning and drawing to kids and adults at the Erie Chapel Institute. It was a Presbyterian-based center. He also taught at the Shalom Aleichem Institute's Chicago branch, a secular Yiddish school. In 1935, he worked on a new panel series with the writer from Master Barber, J.W. Clapman again. This was something called The Baby Doctor, an advice column where readers' infant concerns were addressed. So many letters came in that Clapman was neglecting his medical practice, so he canceled the column. With the end of The Baby Doctor, Hogarth made his way to New York, staying with a friend from his his Academy of Fine Arts days, and being introduced to people at King Features. And that's where he met Lyman Young, who hired Hogarth to draw Tim Tyler's Luck. It was a ghosting job he stayed on through the summer up in Connecticut. Dissatisfied with uncredited work, Hogarth returned to New York and King Features, where he met the writer Charlie Driscoll, who hired him to draw Pieces of Eight. And this was Hogarth's first credited strip. And in this particular paper, it appeared alongside Alex Raymond's Secret Agent. Hogarth was unable to save the strip from cancellation, but by early 1936, he was married and doing well with the Tom Johnstone ad agency. He was still interested in strip work, and in the spring of 1937, an editor friend at United Features asked him if he was interested in trying out for the Tarzan Sunday page. The strip's artist, Hal Foster, was moving on to his own strip, Prince Valiant. So Hogarth submitted a Foster-like page, and he won the assignment. This is it's him when he first got the job. That page, believe it or not, is one of Hal Foster's original pages. So this had to have been right when he first got the job. From there, Hogarth ran with it, and in the process transformed the hero genre in comic art. And some of his work from 1938. There's a page from 1940, original art. A page, it's some of the circulation figures from editor and publisher. It sold very well. It's a page from 1942. So by this time, as in the middle of the war, Hogarth was interested in becoming a combat artist, but he was encouraged by most everyone he talked to stay with Tarzan, as it was felt he was doing more for the war effort in that capacity. But he was involved in some other activities during the war. Remember this, what you see here, this the West Side Defense Council. It's part of a group, community group, where he lived in Manhattan that he worked with. By 1945, Hogarth was aware of the profitable foreign reprints of his work, for which he received nothing. Burroughs and United Features were unwilling to share in those revenues, so Hogarth declined to renew his contract. He'd been working on another strip of his own called Drago, and it was an Argentine gaucho adventure. It appeared with another syndicate, Post Hall, the same month that he quit Tarzan, and it ran to the end of 1946. Returning veterans interested in cartooning had made contact with Hogarth in 1944, and from these informal sessions, a school developed and grew. The Manhattan Academy of Newspaper Art at Hogarth's apartment became the Cartoonists and Illustrators Center, first in a space on Broadway, then in a couple of rooms at the Robert Louis Stevenson School. This is an article about that. At the Stevenson School, kids like Don Perlin and Marvin Stein and Al Williamson took Saturday classes. Hogarth took on a business partner from the Stevenson School who was familiar with the Veterans Administration. After another move to bigger space, the Cartoonists and Illustrators School was formed and as an approved school for veterans in 1947. The rapid growth of C&I had, from the beginning, been built entirely on Hogarth's reputation as an artist and his talent as a teacher. He designed the program, wrote the classes, all of it. Meanwhile, in Hogarth's absence of a year and 8 months, the Tarzan Sunday page had been losing readers at so alarming a rate that Hogarth himself Edgar Rice Burroughs himself ordered the United Features to get Hogarth back. The resulting negotiations hit the same snag, the sharing of revenues from reprints of Hogarth's Tarzan work. The syndicate, again, wouldn't budge, but they did offer Hogarth a pay raise, along with script control and responsibility for both the Sunday and the Tarzan. So he came back in late 1947. It's one of the daily pages. He eventually handed the daily over to his assistant, Dan Barry, who was, see his work here on this daily. On top of that, another of Hogarth's strip ideas, Miracle Jones, was picked up by United Features in March of 1948. It was a humor strip. It made it to January 1950 when it was canceled. On March 19th, 1950, a Sunday, Edgar Rice Burroughs died of a heart attack, allegedly while reading Hogarth's page that morning, this page. Adventure strips were dying off in the post-war era. Peanuts started in 1950 with United Features, and it presaged a period of domestic humor strips and romance strips. Hogarth had his hands full with the school and a recent divorce. So in August 1950, he left Tarzan and strip work altogether. Although he was busy as a teacher, Hogarth still kept his hand in the illustration game, doing some freelance work for magazines like Saga. It's a double-page spread from 1952. Here's another one he did for Saga. Also in 1952, under a pseudonym, he wrote a strip called Martha Hart, with art by one of his students, Ross Andrew. It didn't see publication, but Andrew went on to fame as an artist with DC and Marvel. For the most part, freelance work for Hogarth disappeared after 1952. Hogarth remarried in 1953 and was expecting his first child in late 1955 when he received some odd news from a neighbor. Some government types were snooping around, and this is where the story takes the turn. Any questions?
No.
All right.
Go ahead.
On January 13th, 1956, Hogarth was served with a subpoena to appear at a Senate hearing. The reason, ostensibly, was to account for the Cartoonists and Illustrators School use of VA money. But its real purpose was to extract what they called at that time a congressional confessional from Hogarth as to his alleged communist activities and associations. The permanent subcommittee on investigations had been chaired by Joseph McCarthy, but the elections of 1954 gave Democrats control of the Senate, and John McClellan became the chairman. And that's him with the glasses in the middle here. Robert Kennedy became chief counsel. Roy Cohn had been chief counsel, but he was long gone after the disaster of the Army McCarthy hearings in the summer of 1954, after which McCarthy lost most of his powerful allies in the press and was shunned by most of his colleagues and the White House. He had taken to drinking even more than usual and was neglecting most of his Senate duties. I was initially puzzled as to why he bothered with this hearing, but through the files of both the committee and the FBI, it became clear that targeting schools and teachers was the next phase in the communist that McCarthy had been preparing for in 1954. I recalled one of his speeches during the Army McCarthy hearings where he talked specifically about teachers in schools, which seemed odd for that particular hearing. In fact, at that time, the committee was assembling a case against the Cartoonists and Illustrators School. But all of that was derailed when J. Edgar Hoover, who had been aiding McCarthy by allowing the committee access to the FBI files, pulled the plug in 1954. McCarthy for too long had foolishly accused and insulted the Army and President Eisenhower. Hoover knew when to get off of that train. That was one of McCarthy's doodles on one of his notes during those hearings in 1954, because he couldn't figure out why he was no longer granted access to the files. Still, McCarthy was a senator with a committee seat, and by late 1955, they felt they possessed evidence enough to go forward with a hearing. The school had been dealing, the Cartoonists and Illustrators School had been dealing with the VA since 1947. But what likely spurred this investigation was a letter written by Ted Kirkpatrick in 1951. He was a FBI man during the war, and afterwards he left to start a group called American Business Consultants with a couple of other former FBI men. It's important to bear in mind that nearly all of the Senate subcommittee staff investigators were former FBI. The American Business Consultants published a newsletter called Counterattack. In it, they would accuse mostly those in radio and television of being communists. They also provided a clearance service wherein the accused were allowed the opportunity to prove their Americanism for a small fee and then presumably work again. The whole thing really took off for American Business Consultants with their publication of Red Channels in 1950, just before the outbreak of the Korean War. It was known as the Bible of Madison Avenue. In it, they named all manner of performers whose careers in many cases were debilitated, if not ruined entirely. These are some of the pages from Red Channels. Burgess Meredith, the actor. Zero Mostel. Kirkpatrick, in all likelihood, was also in contact with his FBI buddies on the Senate subcommittee. It was after this letter that he wrote to the VA, specifically naming the Cartoonists and Illustrators School and Burne Hogarth, that the subcommittee takes up the case, namely whether or not the VA was funding a communist school. So on January 17th, 1956, Hogarth appeared before an executive hearing, meaning it was closed, with his attorney. He went so far as to confirm his identity and occupation and duties with the school, but pleaded his amendment rights on the rest. This was largely if you any substantive questions and refused to answer others, you could be held in contempt. Hogarth was not a cooperative witness, And if you were not cooperative, you were called back for a public hearing. And that's what occurred the next day, January 18th. It was largely the same as the executive hearing the day before, except that the press was there, and it was more contentious. Hogarth had to endure the cameras and his accuser, a man he barely knew, named John Huber. Huber had been a New York City FBI informant from 1939 to 1947. He'd lost his job with the WPA in 1939 and, convinced that his fellow employees were communists, had complained to one of his bosses, a reserve Army officer, who put him in touch with an active duty intelligence officer, who then handed Huber off to the FBI to exploit his side gig as a bartender at union meetings. Eventually, Huber would go on the following year to join the Communist Party, and he wrote weekly reports of what he did and who he saw. It was at an alleged communist meeting in 1944 that Huber saw Hogarth. Remember that West Side Council that Hogarth had worked with during the war? It was in that capacity that Hogarth worked with other groups, and some of those people were no doubt Communist Party members, but I doubt Hogarth much cared for a good cause. And Huber didn't bother with distinctions. For him, all of them had to be communists. Dalton Trumbo summed up the problem with informers like Huber by saying that no one will seriously question that informants stood in relation to the FBI as employees stand in relation to a boss. The openly stated hostility of the FBI to the Communist Party justifies doubt that it would pay spies to secure information favorable to that organization. Indeed, it would not stretch credibility to suggest that the FBI requested damaging information about the Communist Party, and that any spy who failed to secure it would lose all value to his employer and be quickly separated from the payroll. This letter is a testament to that fact. If Huber wasn't producing enough useful information, his pay was reduced, as it's being discussed here. Remember the guy who started Counterattack and published Red Channels, Ted Kirkpatrick? He was one of Huber's FBI handlers in 1944-45. He signed this letter, this report. He was also handling his pay. Regardless of what was submitted, the FBI wasn't convinced that Hogarth was a threat, and Hoover himself gave a judgment. It's also important to note that J. Edgar Hoover was a Tarzan fan. In an interview with the New Yorker magazine in late 1937, he listed his favorite comic strips. First was, of course, Dick Tracy and Secret Agent, but of the rest, Tarzan was his favorite. So maybe he was intervening here. The FBI was aware of that correspondence from Kirkpatrick to the VA, but they elected to keep Hogarth's case closed. After Huber left the FBI in 1947, mostly because he could no longer withstand the subterfuge that his life had become, he tried to cash in on his experience by selling his story to whoever would buy it and hiring himself out as a professional witness to any committee that would have him. In 1949, he gave his first public testimony. In it, he named everyone who was an alleged communist from his time as an FBI informant. There's that list. Hogarth is not there. He's mentioned once in passing as having been at some sort of meeting, but that's it. At the Tiding Committee hearings in 1950, investigating communists in the State Department due to McCarthy's accusations, Huber was scheduled to testify as to China expert Owen Latimer. He was flown to Washington by McCarthy and put up in a hotel, but he no-showed the hearing. That's Owen Lattimore. He didn't show up when he was supposed to be there. He claimed he had blacked out and woke up in New York. After this embarrassment, the FBI interviewed him and declared him unstable and unreliable. That brings us back to our hearing in 1956. McCarthy was in top form, insulting and bullying as usual, but he lacked the authority he once held as chairman, and he didn't have the confidence of the public. Still, he and Huber did their damage. 6 months later, the GI Bill was canceled. That's Huber with McClellan and McCarthy that day. In July of 1956, these were some of the headlines after the hearing. In July, the World War II GI Bill was ended, and it nearly bankrupted the Cartoonists and Illustrators School. Only an infusion of cash from Hogarth's business partner kept the school afloat, and a name change was a step towards renewal. That's when it became the School of Visual Arts. Hogarth would endure as well, committing his teaching to print with dynamic anatomy 2 years later in 1958. A steady earner, still in print today. But he was a changed man, and he was never again as politically active. McCarthy drank himself to death 16 months later. Huber kept trying to sell his ever-changing story. The following year, he sold it to Challenge magazine, a sensationalized story of his period with the FBI. He testified in a few minor hearings, then steadily lapsed into alcoholism and mental illness, disappearing in 1960 after he was checked into Bellevue. Ted Kirkpatrick was hoping for a political career after he left Counterattack in 1952. He was running for a congressional seat out of Queens. But when he had left the FBI in 1945, a batch of FBI files had left with him, and he and his American business consultant partners had exploited them and informants, including Huber, to make allegations for profit. This earned him the ire of J. Edgar Hoover, a planted newspaper article painting him as anti-Semitic as election host. He did take the hint and disappeared from New York, resurfacing in Illinois, where he worked for John Deere until retirement 25 years later. Was Hogarth a progressive? Yes. He traveled in those circles. He lent his support to some of those causes. This was something he did in 1937 called the United Palestine Appeal. In 1937, they were helping European Jews get out to Palestine. The U.S. wasn't exactly opening her doors at that point, so I guess Hogarth was, in that sense, a Zionist. This was the poster for the United Palestine Appeal in 1937. Paul Robeson asked for Hogarth's help in his crusade to end lynching in 1946, and Hogarth created this painting to bring attention. One of his former students, William Bradley, once told me that he always knew that Hogarth really did want to make the world a better place. So if You asked me if Hogarth was a communist. I don't think so. That's it.
Thank you. There's a lot to think about. What could you go back to that slide? I had one question.
Yeah.
What are some of the other schools that that they were investigating? Any other New York schools or?
Oh yeah, they were after what was it? A lot of the trade schools, mostly the New York trade schools, were the ones that they were interested in. Annette Rubinstein, who ran the Jefferson School of Social Science, they were
Yeah.
after her in that school.
What about the new school?
That wasn't in that report that I knew of. I don't know if they were ever
Sure.
brought to any of the hearings. I didn't see them anywhere in there. Of course, there were all the separate hearings that we were talking about earlier, of course, of teachers, individual teachers.
And what you showed very briefly, you put up a slide with the faculty of the.
Sure. Yeah, they.
Could you go back to that?
Sure. Let me see if I can find that.
And were they implying the whole school was a hotbed of communism, or just Hogarth?
Sure.
The whole
Sure.
school?
No. They indexed everybody at the school, as far as I know. Where is it? Where?
A little further, I think.
Sure. Where? That guy. Yeah.
Yeah. Who's on there? Tom Gill?
Yeah, Tom Gill, Jerry Robinson, L.J. Mock, and Jim Boyle. They're all there, and they added them all to the file. They also indexed them, or indicated that they did on another document where the same list was there. The index, when they said index, of course, that meant to add them to the security index. And the security index had been created, well, it had different names from the 30s on, but that was the index of people who were considered dangerous. Like if they declared martial law, they were the people that were going to be put in the concentration camps here in America.
Hmm.
But in other documents that are at a later point, Burne was not in the security index. So he may have been at one time, and then they may have removed him, because that's what they would do. You could be on it, then off of it.
Right. And are there any pieces of the testimony that are worth reading, or?
Those pages that I showed are the testimony is largely just going round and round. It's back and forth. Basically, Burne took the Fifth, First, or the Fourth Amendment on just about every question. In these pages of the executive session, he spoke some more, but mostly said no to all their questions, or sorry, wouldn't answer. And so the executive session is shorter, because what the committee was always looking for was the public session, because the press is there, people could be there. So in those sessions, like in the executive session, McCarthy never asked a single question. He's there, but doesn't say anything. So it doesn't go very far, because also Burne was non-cooperative. So they ordered him to come back the next day. So that's these pages say, so you can look at that if you like. I highlighted that part because that's where McCarthy finally jumps in, and really it's the McCarthy show. McCarthy's, as far as I can tell, this is really his last significant hearing appearance. He wasn't really showing up that much to most of his other committee duties. He was drinking a lot, because this was 56. This is coming up on 2 years after he had been censured. He didn't, he no longer had the ear of the press. They weren't really reporting much on what he was doing. But he did show up for this one. And like I say, I think it was because he had already prepared for this hearing. back in 54. He was working on it very diligently. His staff was. So he was already had what he needed in terms of documents that he had gotten from the FBI. As you can see, it's, he's instructed over and over, answer the question. And so he says, I'll answer that with my privilege of the Fifth Amendment.
Right.
That would be his, default that he would have to come back to. That it either invaded his privacy, or he would say, he made the mistake of getting into arguments earlier about the purview of the committee or whether they had the right to ask him those kinds of questions. And they're playing plenty of semantic games. They would phrase the question, when you were a communist, stuff like that. Yeah. He would answer, I never said that.
Yeah. Robert Louis Stevens.
So in the entire testimony is like this, round and round and round.
Right.
And then finally it's over.
Right. And you mentioned before we started the event that this is something Hogarth didn't talk about.
Never.
This part of his
there's one at one point in Gary Groth, of course, he spent hours. Well, he knew Burne for years, but he spent hours in a interview capacity. I know, speaking about it, and then that was all transcribed into a very long, thorough interview with Burne. And I believe at one point in that, Gary, you asked him, I think even directly, did anything happen during the Blacklist years? And Burne dodged it. I mean, he just moved on. I don't remember him really. He just said not much of anything, as I recall.
Right, that's right. And in fact, I asked him. You probably remember this, but I asked him how he felt in 1954 during the Senate subcommittee hearings about comics. And he said he knew nothing about them. He didn't pay any attention to them. He was unaware of them. He actually asked me to tell him what that was all about in the interview, which I did. And I, to this day, I'm not sure I understand that.
I mean, neither do I. I'd love to ask him now, because now I wouldn't take no for an answer. But like I mentioned to Ben earlier, I knew Don Punchatz real well, and he was one of Burne's great proteges as an illustrator. And they were very good friends for the rest of their lives. And I brought this up to Don, and he said, that's funny. He was a student there in 1956 at SVA when these hearings happened. He became very good friends with Burne afterwards. They saw each other every year, multiple times. When Burne came to Dallas-Fort Worth, they always had dinner. And during one of those occasions, I think in 1976, it was 20 years after the fact, they were, the two of them, just having dinner. And Don Punchatz brought that up. He said, Burne, I've always wanted to ask you what that was all about back in 1956, what was going on. And Burne said, I don't want to talk about that. And that was the end of it. Don said he never brought it up again. So he didn't talk about it to anybody. Connie, his wife, who I knew well, I asked her this very same thing. I thought for sure, there must have been more of a dialogue about it. And she said that it was never really brought up. It was mentioned in passing a couple of times, but they had no long or deep conversations about it at all. So I think that it had a profound effect on Burne.
It's fascinating because I didn't know enough about that to ask him. If I did, I probably would have.
Me neither. I never knew.
He obviously never brought it up. I never asked him about it, but I never knew Burne to dissemble or evade. And so it makes that all the more mystifying as to why he would in that one instance. I mean, it's the only instance I know of where he ever did that.
Well, I talked to his son, Michael Hogarth, who was a teenager at the time, And he remembers it because he said it was also on TV. Part of it had been on TV because I've not found anything from the TV stuff. I'd love to see any of it. But he said that Burne was profoundly different after that. Before that hearing, he was of a certain humor, of a certain disposition, and that after that, he did not have that same humor at all. He was just not the same guy. I mean, he still had a sense of humor, but not the one that Michael knew as a kid, as a boy. And he said that, I mean, Burne lived with Michael when he moved to Los Angeles in 1981 and lived with him for a few years. They never talked about it. Michael said it did not come up, and he did not. He may have mentioned to me that he brought it up briefly once, but Burne wasn't having it. He just didn't want to talk about it. I think it very much disturbed his sense of his country, what he felt about his country, and what he had believed about his country up until that point. And afterwards, I think he was very much shaken about it. You got to remember when, like I said, Connie was pregnant with their first kid when these hearings went on. And she told me that they caught wind of something that was going on in the fall of '55. Like I told you, there were some people snooping around. She said that they knew that their mail was being opened. And that was standard FBI practice, was to open your mail. They had big mail opening operations in Washington, D.C. and New York. They had whole offices where they opened mail. They had a whole process of opening mail, putting it back and resealing it so that it looked normal. And she knew they were opening their mail. They thought their phone, Michael told me that he thought that their phone might have been tapped. And their neighbors told him that some people had been snooping around. When Burne found out about this, he was worried because Connie said that he started getting rid of any books that he thought, could be problematic. Correspondence, he burned some stuff, she said, and she was against that. She didn't think he should do it. And that's when
Let me ask you a question or two. I mean, first of all, there was nothing for Burne to be embarrassed about. He held fast. He did not name names.
Exactly.
He really held his ground. Do you think? And you and I, you knew Burne, right? You spent time with him. So Burne was a fighter.
Yeah.
I mean, there's someone here who posted that there was probably some degree of trauma, and that's probably, that I wouldn't discount that. But man, Burne, if you knew Burne, you knew that he was a goddamn fighter.
That's right. I mean, when you read this whole thing, and it all reads like these pages you're seeing. This is how the whole thing goes. He never raises his voice, and of course, he had an attorney with him. I think he had been counseled to be very careful, because the other thing we don't know is who of Burne's friends got the bad end of this, and that's something we don't know. And I am confident that he may have known some people who got blacklisted. I mean, he got blacklisted effectively. I mentioned that his freelance work dried up in 1952. There's a reason for that. That's when that investigation was going. That's when Kirkpatrick wrote that letter to the VA. The VA was then contending with Cartoonists and Illustrators over funding. There was a lawsuit that, in fact, came out right around that time where I think CNI sued them. So there was a lot going on, and I think he was worried about the school. He was worried about him being held in contempt and going to jail because he had a kid on the way. And I reminded Connie of that. I said, you were pregnant with your first kid. He was probably didn't want to be a dad in jail. And she very much agreed with that. She goes, no, that makes sense. She had not considered that at the time, because she was, Connie became very much part of the new left. There's a real split there. Burne was old left, and Connie became very active coming into the 60s and into the 70s. She was the new left and very militant. And, she thought that he shouldn't, do anything to protect himself in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that Burne was cowed?
I don't know. I maybe somewhat, but I mean, he had 2 days. He had the executive and he knew what was coming on this day, on January 18th. I think he was mortified. I just think he was stunned that this was happening to him, because I don't think he was in the Communist Party. Everything, I've looked at a whole lot more than I'm showing here, because I can't show it all. Thousands of pages of documents from Huber's file. Huber's file, the guy who accused him, his FBI file is almost 6,000 pages. His reports, that he kept a copy of, was over 1,000 pages. Hogarth's in there only 3 or 4 times, having come to some meetings as part of the West Side Legislative Council and that community organization, when he worked with these other groups, and he knew Annette Rubinstein, he knew Bella Dodd in New York, and the FBI talked to her. They went and asked everybody. There's a whole lot of other documents where they went and talked to Louis Boudins, the big witness. I don't know if they talked to Harvey Matusow, because he was already out by then, but they talked to a lot of the other big witnesses, and none of them knew anything about. They'd never heard of Hogarth. Bella Dodd knew him personally, and she told him she thought he was in the Communist Party because of the stuff that he had been involved with, the activism, but she didn't know for 100%, but she presumed he was, but only for a period of 1944-45, that's when he was involved in some of these things, before he got when he took that break from Tarzan, but then he was on Drago too. He only had so much time. I just don't think he was, because his name doesn't turn up anywhere on any of those rolls, like the communist membership rolls. I've seen him at the Tamiment Center there. He's not there. I just think he lent his name. If you see in some of those, like that report, he knew Orson Welles and Frank Sinatra. These were other people that he had helped to help organize other events that he was a part of. Rallies, Roosevelt, and junk like that.
Well, I can understand Burne being disconcerted and even terrified, at the possibility of the destruction of his career and his life.
Yeah, in the school.
But what I don't quite understand, knowing Burne as well as I did, is that 20 or 25 years later, I would have expected him to be railing against this. When he was obviously safe. He was no longer in jeopardy.
He must not have believed that. I think that Burne felt like he was never safe after that. I think, they must have known, he must have seen hard evidence that they were opening his mail, or that they had broken into the apartment to look through things. Who knows? Because they would be gone, and one of his neighbors may have well told him that someone was in his apartment, but they knew that they were opening the mail, and that and they had asked around about them. I've seen that's in the FBI reports, that they were interviewing other people in his apartment building about him. He must have been very worried that, you got to remember where he came from too. What happened to his people is his father his father must have told him about being in Russia back then, in the Russian Empire, and having to flee because of the pogroms, where they were killing Jews in Russia, the Black Hundreds. If you read about all of that, in the failed revolution of 1905, and his father tacitly supported that. He was progressive. He may have barely escaped with his life. I think all of that had an enormous effect on Burne. You have to remember also, I was telling Ben earlier about Michael, Burne's son, told me about when he went to visit, I think his sister. Burne had an older sister who was born over in Russia, Millie. She was about 15 years older than him. She was living in Chicago, and when Michael was a kid over there, he remembered seeing in the closet by the front door, I was telling Ben about this, Michael told me it was called a knipple and a peckle. And these were 2 Jewish terms. They sound cute, but they're not. The knipple was a bag of money, and the peckle was like a go bag, what we'd call a bug out bag now. But these were the 2 things that you were supposed to grab with you if you were heading out the door in a hurry, because the police, the Russian police, were after you, or the Black Hundreds had showed up, or a pogrom was going to happen. These were the only 2 things you were going to take with you. and his sister still kept those by the front door. So this clearly had to have been a part of Burne's upbringing, that mindset.
So you think they were trying to build a bigger, just use him to build out this case against schools that
Of course.
actually had maybe left-leaning material that they were teaching, not that the cartoonist school was, not that I know what they were teaching there.
Well, the one thing I will say as far as that is that the one thing relevant to that I've heard, and this was from either Doug Crane or William Bradley, who were both in his course in January 1956. I think it was William Bradley told me that. He said that when Burne got back from those hearings, before the next class that he taught in, before the class started, he asked the class, he said, does anyone here feel that I've been, preferring or teaching a communist ideology or communist ideas? And he said that all of them were utterly confused by the question. They all looked at each other and looked at him and said, no. Why do you ask that? And he said, it's fine, let's get on with class. And that was it. And it was never brought up again. So I guess he bounced it off the guys in that class to sound them out, because I guess he was doubting, was I teaching communism and not knowing it? But that was it. That's the only thing I've heard about as far as a follow-up.
Right. So I don't know if I didn't quite catch. So you're saying cutting off, was the school in trouble before they cut off the GI funding?
No, not at all.
That's what precipitated it.
The GI Bill constituted I think so. It was definitely connected. Maybe not as much, but the school had received up until that time, I think, 1.8 million since 1947. That's equivalent to 10 or 11 million dollars now in VA, GI Bill money, and that accounted for at least half of the school's revenues. Right. So when the GI Bill ended, that was a lot of money disappeared, because almost half the students at least were GIs on GI Bill.
Yeah.
So that just about sunk them.
Yeah, someone once mentioned to me that the GI Bill was responsible for the growth of teaching art at a university level all across the country. Yeah. A lot of, I guess, returning servicemen decided that's why they would go to college to study art and all kinds.
Yeah, Cartoonists and Illustrators Center was one of the first ones, because the veterans were people who had written to Burne during the war that liked Tarzan. So he had correspondence going with a lot of people. He was a big letter writer. He wrote to lots of people, and lots of people wrote to him. And some of these people who were New Yorkers either called him up or wrote him and said, "Can I drop by?" And they dropped by his apartment, and he would say, "Yeah, come by." And they would, maybe get to watch him work and talk about working in the business, different veterans. And these informal sessions is really how the school got going. Was in his apartment. Then so many people started showing up that he had to start renting some space somewhere, and he did over on Broadway. And then he, I guess, I don't know how he got connected up. Maybe he knew Annette Rubenstein, who ran the Robert Louis Stevenson School, because she also ran the Jefferson School of Social Science. And so they had space at that building, and those were the pictures I showed. That's when he started having Saturday classes over there, and put that ad out, and kids were showing up. And that's when he met people like Al Williamson, who was 14 when he started taking classes, and Marvin Stein, who was 13 or so, and Don Perlin, who was 12 when he started taking classes with Burne. And all of them, of course, went on to work for Marvel and DC, of course, Fawcett first, but the major publishers after that.
Right.
Later, a lot by the late 40s, everybody was coming to the Cartoonists and Illustrators School who could get there. Gil Kane and Wally Wood and Bernie Crickstein and Frank Frazetta was there, and Ross Andrew, Mike Esposito, and Dick Ayers, Joe Sennett, and Angelo Torres, the Flegel gang. They were at Cartoonists and Illustrators. And of course, by the 50s, Stan Lee, and I guess it was, who was the editor? Joe Shuster was at Siegel. They would come over to the school to pilfer talent to come work on the comic books. And Burne never begrudged that at all. He allowed them to do it and was happy for these kids to get the jobs. But that's a lot of them. It was like a funnel. They came to Cartoonists and Illustrators and then would get snatched up by the publishers to come work on comics.
Right. So it was this connection with the Jefferson School, maybe.
Annette Rubinstein
this was
ran both of them.
It's a place where they were studying Marxism. I mean,
at the Jefferson School, yeah.
So so how long was he running it out of there? For a while?
Not that long. That was maybe a year or so.
That might have been the main evidence. I don't know, not knowing what else he did in his life.
He was a working cartoonist and teacher. That's what occupied most of his time. He worked he was a newspaper guy, working in illustration and cartooning all his life. And he worked a lot. He only had so much time, for even activism. Mostly he lent his name, like he did with the United Palestine Appeal. I would love to see any of that, because if you saw the names, Rube Goldberg and all the cartoonists who are in that list. Rube Goldberg ran the Cartoonist Cavalcade, or whatever it's called, and they probably did caricatures and original sketches and all that stuff. And it was at Madison Square Garden. I can imagine, I'm hoping to see one of the books that came out after that, from that United Palestine Appeal, this thing, where all the people who were there from film, from radio, and cartoonists.
Hey, K.A., you said Burne was probably a Zionist. How certain are you of that?
Oh, I mean that in the sense of, in 1937, when, this was, Jews were trying to get out of Europe. The Nazis had taken over, and things were very bad in Germany and Austria. That's what the United Palestine Appeal was all about. They were raising money to help Jews get out of Europe and over to Palestine. So that's what I mean. He could be referred to in that sense at that time as a Zionist, because that was the movement that was going on. The Jews were being turned away from immigrating to the U.S. at that point. That's why this organization was doing what it was doing. And Burne, was lending his name and his help to that because he was a Jew. But as far as Zionism as we understand it now, not a chance. There's no way Burne would support the militant Zionism that we currently see now. I
don't think so. I can't remember Burne once invoking his Jewish heritage.
No, he didn't talk about that at all.
Talking about that.
Yeah, he never did. It was not something he talked about, except among family. I mean, somewhat. I know he spoke some about it to Michael and of course Connie, but he was not observant in any way. I mean, he was generally, his adult life, he was secular, but he spoke Yiddish. Yiddish was, I could argue that it was his first language. He was certainly bilingual, but he spoke it fluently, much to the surprise of some of his relatives later in life. One of his, I guess it's a niece of his, through his brother Harvey, she was some of the relatives were having dinner with him in New York, and they went to some restaurant. She told me about it. She said that at the door, he knew the guy who owned this restaurant, and they proceeded to have a whole conversation in Yiddish, and she was stunned. And when they were sitting at the table later, she said, "Uncle Spin, I didn't know you spoke Yiddish." And he said, "Of course I do."
Huh.
He taught at the Sholem Aleichem Institute, a Yiddish school, on the emergency education program with the WPA.
Right.
But his upbringing, because he was brought up in it for sure in Chicago. He did not speak about his nephew Perez Zagorin, who was very close to him because they were only 11 or 12 years apart, because he was his older sister Millie's son, and she was 15 years older than Burne. So his nephew was only, I think, 11 or 12 years younger than him. They were very close in Chicago, and he talked about a lot of the Jewish services and activities that they went to when they were young in Chicago.
Do you know much? I mean, I was a good friend of Burne's for the last 20 years, approximately the last 20 years of his life, but you're the scholar. Do you know what his professional life was like in the last 20 or 30 years of his life?
Sure. So in 19, so when did you move west?
We moved, I moved in 84 and Burne, I think, moved in 81, if I remember correctly.
That's correct. So in 81 is when he got divorced again from Connie. And then that's when he packed it up and moved west to Los Angeles, and he moved in with Michael in LA. And he already had a job. He was teaching at the Parsons in LA because I forgot who he knew, but somebody, it might have been Phil Hayes, because Phil Hayes had been either a former student or somebody he knew at the Parsons in New York, because he had done some teaching at Parsons in New York in the 70s after he left SVA in 1970. So when he went out there, he already had a job. Then he did some seminars or something at Parsons. Then either it was Phil Hayes, I think, who then offered him a job at the Art Center in Pasadena. Mm-hmm. And then he taught at Art Center Pasadena for the rest of his life there in LA to 96.
And did that represent most of his connection to professionals, to a professional community?
Yeah. I mean, he left.
As far as I know, very few cartoonists or comic artists, and very few cartoonists and comic artists liked him.
As a person?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I think after that hearing, his sense of humor was not what it was. And there were some cartoonists that liked Al Jaffe, loved him. He told me so.
But I know so many cartoonists and artists who.
He was very critical.
I mean, they just couldn't stand to be around him.
Yeah.
Actively disliked him because he was, he really was an aesthetic dissident.
Totally. He wasn't part of the program. He never did comic books. He'd only, he did covers for Sparkler in the 40s and into the early 50s, but that's it. He never did comic books. He only did the comic strip work. And once he left it in 1950, he was done with strip work. He never did it again, except for the graphic novels in 72 and 76. He considered himself a fine artist, and most of comics to him were inane.
Yeah, he had a lot of unbridled contempt for comic books and even newspaper strips.
Yeah, he didn't see him as very good for the most. The truth is, most of them aren't terribly good. There are some good ones, but that's only here and there. He thought Spiegelman was pretty good because he complimented Spiegelman once. But he didn't see a lot that he liked for the most part in comics. Here and there. He liked some of the Hernandez brothers stuff. It's here and there, pieces of work here and there that he thought was pretty good, but he wasn't real high. You know this. He wasn't real high on most of the work that was happening. But there were plenty of people that certainly admired and emulated his work. I mean, the Silver Age to me is largely a result of his work on Tarzan. I know that Jack Kirby is the progenitor of it, but that style, Kirby's style, is very much modeled on what Burne did in Tarzan. And Kirby admitted as much, that a lot of what he was doing was he was trying to bring the whole dynamic style that Burne pioneered, especially once he codified it in the book in 1958. You see Kirby's style evolve very quickly into the early 60s. And it's that Hogarth approach. And then, of course, so many of the others were his students, Gil Kane and, the Barry brothers and Bernie Crickstein and Wally Wood and Harry Harrison and Frazetta, all of them.
Do you have testimony from his students as to how they rated him as an instructor?
Oh yeah, there's tons of them. If you want, I don't have them on this slideshow, but some of those are hysterical, which is they're contradictory, some of them within the same evaluation. And of course that has to do with these evaluations at Art Center are, rate your teacher based on their expertise or whatever, 0 to 5 kind of thing, where you would circle on the numbers. And then there were some questions where you're allowed to write things down, and they're all anonymized. And some of these evaluations they're judgmental. Like, I don't like this guy's attitudes. He's very, very critical. Yet in the same thing later on, they would say, I learned a tremendous amount from this teacher. Yeah. His expertise is phenomenal. His knowledge, but I don't like the way he talks to me. Or one of them, I swear to God, one of them says, I didn't take this class to learn from him why he doesn't believe in God. I'll find these for you and send them to you. But there's tons of them, and I read them all. There was dozens and dozens and dozens, and he kept them.
That makes sense. I was able to sit in on one of his tutorials, and it was probably a 90-minute, maybe a 2-hour class. And I'm not a drawer, but I wanted to see how he taught, and I wanted to experience that. And I would best describe his technique as learn or die.
Yeah.
Because he was just like an educational tsunami.
Yeah, there's a lot coming at you.
Bellowing at the students. I mean, none of that would fly today.
And I think he got more from talking to his earlier students from the 50s. Like I said, I think after the hearing, he just became a little bit more brittle, and was more inclined to yell some, because he didn't do that as much. I asked, like Don Punchatz, did he yell, in class? And he goes, no, not much. He could raise his voice, but he didn't yell at you. There were things that he did that like Don. I asked Don about, Alex. What's his name? Not Raymond, but always call him the Raymond clone. Al Williamson. Al Williamson. I remember reading an interview where Al Williamson didn't like Burne, but he took his classes from when he was 14, and he complained about. He said Burne would come over and look at your drawing, and then with his own pencil go write on your drawing and correct something or draw on it. And Al Williamson was mortified by this, that someone would draw on his drawing like it was a masterpiece. I don't know what Al thought, but he took great offense that Burne would do things like that, and it stayed with him a long time. I mean, Burne offered him the opportunity to assist him on 1 or 2 Tarzan pages in the late 40s. And Al started to do it, but he turned him down because he felt like he wasn't good enough. He then did work on a couple of pages at some point in 1949 or so, or 48. But he had the stats from him. He kept them. But he could be hard on the students. There's, no doubt. I mean, he at Art Center, I think it may have been Phil Hayes that told me, he would get complaints from students about, how forceful Burne could be. He was very hard on students that were from other countries if their English wasn't very good. He would give them a hard time about their English. He didn't like it if their English wasn't as good as his. So no doubt he was tough on them. I mean, I saw him give talks at some of the conventions, and he had a temper, no doubt about it.
Yeah, he would yell over dinner.
Michael drew a couple of great, Michael Hogarth, his son, who was enormously talented as well. He could draw like he was as good as Burne in some ways as a draftsman. He drew a couple of great sketches of Burne talking and banging on the table. And he even put a caption on there, and it said, you know, he said at the bottom, it said, basically any conversation with Burne goes this way. And Burne would be banging on the table and say, shit, man, you know, I'm serious. I've never forgotten.
You experienced that, right?
Oh yeah. I got him mad at me a couple of times, but it never bothered me. I mean, and I think that's what it came down to. Did you take it personally or not?
It never bothered me.
Yeah.
And but I know a lot of people it did bother.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Plenty have told me that they were, you know, they were mortified or they were cowed by him. Students who said it was hard, like they bore it because they wanted to learn from him. But if they had it any other way, they'd have taken it any other way, because they were, you know, students became very scared of him, you know, that he was going to yell at.
The fact is, none of it was malicious. None of it.
Never.
I never felt that way. That personally attacking me. It was always, you know, whenever he was screaming and pounding on the table, which he would do in restaurants.
Yeah.
It was always about philosophical issues.
Yep. The bigger picture.
Yeah. It was never, you know, it was never petty.
No.
Never about you.
I asked some of those very same students, you know, I said, did he ever personally insult you? Did he ever insult your person? And they said, no, never. He was just loud, and he scared them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he was incredibly passionate.
Yep.
Which is what, you know, one of the things I loved about him.
No, I mean, he was in it for real and for the long haul. And, I mean, you know, if he said he was going to do something, he did it, and he was going to do it 100%, you know, whatever it was.
Which is why I was almost surprised at how disciplined he was during those hearings. You know, I half expected to start reading that because I hadn't read it until you sent it to me, but I was half expected to start reading it and hear and read him telling the committee to go fuck themselves.
Right, like in The Front, that Woody Allen film that's written by a blacklisted writer, directed by Martin Ritt, a blacklisted director, and Woody Allen plays the character in that. The Front, it's called. It's a great little period movie about that, and that's what he does at the end of his hearing. I don't recognize the authority of this committee, and furthermore, you can all go fuck yourselves. That would have been Burne, I guess, but I think he was being very cautious. I think for him, he probably couldn't believe, he was incredulous that this was happening to him. You know, this was a guy who had, you know, supported the war effort. He had supported what he believed always were good causes and had, you know, I just think he was very carefully watching his step, because he didn't want to lose the school. He didn't want to go to jail, because I guess he believed that was a real possibility. And it certainly it was, because he knew what had been going on. He'd seen what had happened to, you know, the Hollywood 10 and other people who had been held in contempt, jailed, fined.
Obviously rehearsed very carefully and was very disciplined.
Yes. Yeah. His attorney was sitting right there next to him. William Auerbach was his attorney.
So what were his, so did he talk about politics late when you knew him in the last 20 years of his life?
Oh, very much so. Oh yeah. Current events
What were his politics? I mean, was he?
He was a leftist. He was very progressive oriented, always.
Yeah. Hated
reading. Yeah. He didn't like it. Yeah. He was a left. He was a progressive, in pretty much all ways. I was going back through some of those papers. Like I showed one brief picture of, that syllabus he was working on. That was the original syllabus for the Cartoonists and Illustrators School. And in that, I mean, he was making provisions for students with disabilities. He was, you know, his idea for Cartoonists and Illustrators was it was going to be an American Bauhaus. That's what he was shooting for. He was shooting to build that kind of school. And that's what the syllabus reflects. Who he wanted to be able to bring in to go to school there. He wanted to, I mean, the whole model was you bring in professionals who work in what it is you're trying to teach. So he's a cartoonist, illustrator. That's what he's teaching. You know, he brought in Jerry Robinson. He brought in Marvin Stein, one of his former students. He was later a teacher there. Paul Reinman was a teacher there, a guy who had worked on Tarzan. There were so many people that had come from the field, whatever it is that they did, technical illustrators, whatever, like Don Perlin, who was a student, then went to work for the comics coming into the late 40s and early 50s. Then when the bottom dropped out of the comics business, I think it was something like 80% of comics titles disappeared by the mid 50s, late 50s. Right. They were gone. Don Perlin then went back to school again at SVA for technical drawing so he could get a regular job because there was no comic book work. He went back, became a technical drawer, and was working for the government doing technical drawing work. And then somebody got a hold of him in the early 60s, probably Stan Lee or somebody who he'd known from the old days, an editor at Marvel. And that's how he comes back into comics and then works on the Hulk and then spends the rest of his career in comics. But
so you say he didn't think highly of the comics that were being made. And
no, he never did.
So did he aspire? Did he think this was a form of high art, or
he felt it? Yeah.
That's why he despised the comics that were being produced, because he thought it was a high art.
So what did he make of modernism, of high, what was going on in New York in the 50s?
Well, Dynamic Anatomy, that book was his response to the Figure is Dead, that movement of the abstract expressionists. He was alarmed by all that. He understood, he didn't think it shouldn't happen, but what he was alarmed by as a teacher is what he was hearing. And what he was hearing in the halls at SVA is the figure is dead. We don't need to learn how to draw anymore. And he was, very much troubled by that. And he was being challenged on that basis. Like, why should we study figure drawing or anatomy or any of it? And so Dynamic Anatomy was really his answer to that, which is you need to learn it for this reason, because if you learn this, then you can go do whatever you want. And that's a valid argument, but it took a while. I mean, for a few years there, he said that, he and that kind of work was being denigrated in the popular press and on the street. And he said, so this was it was a real cultural war that was going on. And, he had his side, and his side was he was on the side of, structure and classicism. You could do whatever else you wanted after that, because he would point to somebody like Picasso, and Picasso's early work is all figurative and structured. And then he moves on to something else, but he felt you had to have something as a basis for drawing. And for him, it was the figure.
Yeah, you had to have a foundation.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, it's an interesting.
He loathed comic books, and I'm not sure about newspaper strips, but I'm sure he didn't think too highly of most newspaper strips.
Yeah.
Then there was this odd contradiction that I always felt, and I have to say that I liked Burne more than I liked his work.
Yeah.
He was just such a good pal, and so smart, so passionate. But then he would talk in these lofty terms about Tarzan, and now we all know Tarzan isn't high art.
Exactly. It's a pulp novel.
A pulp novel. And yet Burne would see all of these high art values in Tarzan. And of course, and we got into arguments about that. None of which moved him. But he kind of invested Tarzan with, he legitimized Tarzan with symbology and, expressionism. And I really thought that was mostly bullshit.
I thought he was very right about that, because over the years I did a tremendous amount of research into Burroughs, because I read the books, and Burne did not think the books were high art. What he thought is you had a good story in there, and he was digging into the basic concepts, the feral child. So this gets into different human myths and myth stories. And that's what he seized on. He was Burroughs' favorite Tarzan artist. There's a reason for that, because he saw what Burroughs, I think, saw in this character. Did he flesh it out as well as it could be fleshed out? No. Burne only did the first book And the sixth book, number 6, was Jungle Tales, because I think for him, those were the two best things Burroughs wrote. Because if you look at those books and read some of the passages, Burroughs had great insight into human nature, character, thinking. There is some really great literature there, but it's only in passages. It's pieces of it. That's what Burne seized on. That's what he was trying to bring out, and that's what he was trying to visualize. I think that's what he did. That's what he was getting at. He saw a great story in there, if only he could illustrate it, and he did. So, you know, when he finally got free reign with the graphic novels, which were some of the first of their kind, where he was kind of charting new territory, he had free reign to do what he wanted there, and he did. So that's why there's all the what he called the cryptosthetic devices, the faces in the trees. So these were other levels of expressing some of what's supposed to be happening in that story. The interior life really is what Jungle Tales is all about, is the interior life of this character. You know, is Tarzan probable? No, not at all. Is it possible? Yeah, there have been feral children. I've read whole books on famous feral children going back to the 18th century. The famous one's The Wild Boy of Avignon in France, which is a well-documented case about this kid who was brought up by wolves. And anyway, that's a whole nother literature. Burne read a lot about that. He read a lot about anthropology and human studies. He read tons of history. You were at, Gary, I know you were at his house, his apartment. He had so many books, and those were what was left that came with him from New York. He told me once that some of his books and some of his art got lost in shipment from New York to LA. So who knows what got lost. But I think that's what he was trying to do with Tarzan. He was investigating and making statements about human nature and human history, human character.
No, I think you're right. I mean, my question is, was he successful in doing it? And I don't think he necessarily was. I believe that's what he was trying to do.
Yeah, I think in Jungle Tales he did, but I once sat down with Burne and I went through every page of Jungle Tales because I had questions about certain pages. And so we talked about every page in that book at length. I remember, I think that was in Dallas when I was with him for 12 hours at one table. We sat and went through that book page by page. The first book is very good and everything, but the second book is where he was kind of pulling out all the stops because it was his last Tarzan. He never touched Tarzan again after it because he felt like he had done all he was going to do with that character. But we went through those pages, and that's where, with me, he spoke at length about what he did in some of these pages and why he did it, and what he was trying to get at by his drawing aesthetic, his inking aesthetic, his lettering aesthetic, the hidden images, both positive space imagery, negative space imagery. He did all of that in that book if you know where to look for it. That's what's weird. It's all there. I mean, I've done a whole thing on just one story from that book. I did a presentation once, and it took that long to show what's in these pictures. And I asked him, if someone doesn't see this, does the story still work? And he said, absolutely. He goes, the point is that some of this you will perceive consciously and some of it unconsciously. And that's how he was trying to communicate. The one thing he regretted was that Jungle Tales was in black and white. And that's the only way it's ever appeared in English. But abroad, it's appeared in color. And in color is where he had a whole nother level to communicate. And there's pages in that book. I can show them to you now if you want, but there's pages in that book that if you look at it and you say, okay, how would you color this page? And then I show you the colored page that he did. That is not the way you would have done it, but it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first Tarzan book, was that around 72, 73?
Exactly, 72 with Watson Guptill and Don Holden.
That was one of the earliest, I mean, if you want to call it a graphic novel.
Yeah.
It was before, it was 6 years before Eisner's Contract with God.
Oh yeah. But it was just after, of course he was close with Gil Kane, just like you were. And Gil had done Black Mark in 68.
No, that would be more like 70 or 71. It was after
Savage,
which was 68 or 9.
Yeah. So he had done those two books, and those are basically graphic novels. Now, are they, style, as far as structuring and everything, they're on the way there. They're certainly a bridge, but, Burne knew, he had seen that stuff, but he didn't intend to really do anything like that. The reason that happened was really because of Maurice Horn and all the French scholars. They were constantly badgering him about doing more Tarzan. And I know they had some influence in getting that done because they also lobbied with Burroughs for them to do a book with Burne. And so Don Holden over at Watson Guptill, his publisher for all the anatomy books, said, yeah, we'll do that book. So, it's a fine arts publisher is who published Tarzan of the Apes. And they published it at that time in 11 languages around the world. That had never happened before with a comic. Yeah. That just had not happened. So to me, that really marks the kind of the first graphic novel, though the term wasn't in use then. Burne called it, we were pictorial fiction or the graphic narrative. He had a lot of phrases for it. But yeah, later on, he told me about him and Will Eisner used to share the train home out of New York City up towards Pleasantville, because Burne used to take the train in every day. And he said him and Will Eisner used to share the train going home on occasion. And when he was working on Jungle Tales in 1974, 75, he, on the train rides, he was showing Will those pages, and they were talking about the whole concept of this type of book. And then, of course, Will does A Contract with God in 77. I have no doubt that Burne had an influence on Will to do that, his own book.
Burne despised Eisner.
I know. He came to later and later. I think the Eisner Awards really set him off.
What, he despised him just personally? Or his work?
I mean, they knew each other going back to the 40s. But, and as far as I know, it was, civil. All I know is that, I think it had to do with the Eisner Awards, because he told Gary in that interview, I remember he said that, have you ever seen such a disgusting thing? He thought, I think he thought it was so improper for Will to be alive and to allow an award to be named after him. And not only that, to then accept one of those very awards, which Will did. So it is weird. You have to admit that it's odd.
I think, this is probably neither here nor there, but I think it was before the Eisners. Eisner started in 87, I think 87. And I think I remember Burne, yes. In fact, I know of a story where they got into a huge, a typically, Burne screaming argument in around 70, well, maybe around 81. And may not have spoken after that.
Maybe that was it. Maybe that was the breach. But all I know, the whole time I knew him, he didn't like him.
He was caused because of Burne's contempt for Eisner, and he couldn't hide it, and Eisner couldn't stand it. But I think the animosity was personal and professional.
Yeah. Jack Kirby talked about, I remember Jack Kirby talking about working for Eisner, and Kirby called working for Eisner working in a sweatshop. And he said that without humor. And I think Burne didn't admire Will for his business practices. That's for sure. How he ran, his publishing. But that was Eisner's business. I think you're probably right. There must've been some break between them over God knows what. Will was disingenuous. I observed him be that way more than once in interviews and whatnot. Will, took credit for the graphic novel, and he knew damn well that wasn't the case. Remember, they would call Will the father of the graphic novel. Some people still had done that. And I've always scoffed at that because Burne had already done 2 graphic novels by the time Will did one. It's like Stan Lee. He was never one to refuse credit for something, whether he had earned it or not. I'm not saying that Will's like Stan Lee in that respect, but there's parallels with this type of behavior. And Burne deplored that sort of thing
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Right. Right. It's interesting. I did not know that they were on the train going back and forth together. That's fast. Man, I wish we could have been a fly on that train wall.
I mean, I've seen correspondence between them during that same period when there's letters between them when Burne was president of the National Cartoonist Society. Totally civil, and they had the meetings, and Will was at those meetings. Al Jaffa told me he was, and there was no knockdown, drag out, or any of those.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I can imagine Burne being very collegial and professional.
yeah, and he, as far as I know, he always was. But yeah, I think you and I speculated once when Burne was put into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame, which I had a role in, oddly enough, because I gave a lecture about Burne and his work at the Center for Cartoon Studies here in Vermont, where Steve Bissett teaches, and those very students ended up being the nominating committee for the Eisner Awards that year. And the first person they nominated for the Hall of Fame was Burne Hogarth.
That
So
was Burne. Well, Burne wasn't alive at that point, right?
no, this is all posthumous. And yeah, but I remember I think I told you about it, and you speculated as to whether if Burne was alive, would he have accepted that honor? And I think we were agreed that I don't know if he would have or not. It's a toss up whether he would have said, take this award and shove it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great, lots of stuff to think about.
Mm.
Yeah, the hyper-muscular Jewish cartoonist who wants to make not physics. They want to draw I mean, and what that has to do with the reinvention of the Jew in Zionism, not to get the Jew into this the, the super Jew. Yeah, it's
Well, like Siegel and Schuster for sure.
yeah.
With Hogue,
But yeah,
yeah.
but there are lots of books about Zionism going back from way before the state of Israel, and
Yeah.
wasn't as a lot of stuff was terrible things were going on,
Oh yeah.
paramilitary equip.
Yep.
So I mean, a lot of people, just even socialists, were looking the other way because post-war or coming up to the war, people were looking the other. We're not looking at it too carefully what was going on
No,
there.
I mean Burne was well aware of what was happening, and I think that's why he lent his support to the Night of Stars, it was called, at Madison Square Garden. I'm just very curious as to all the cartoonists that were there, and was Gary may know, as I know there were a lot of Jewish cartoonists or Jews who were in comics, many. Gil Kane was, wasn't he Gil Katz?
Eli Katz.
Eli Katz, yeah. I'm curious as to, going back in time when Burne was working for the newspaper strips and all of that, which of the other cartoonists were also Jews, and what was their thinking and attitudes on what was happening, especially in the 30s in Europe.
Well, yeah, I meant what was happening in Palestine, not what was
Right.
happening in Europe. So anyway, it's an interesting story, but that connection, I never thought of the two to get together, the muscular comic strip hero and the reinvention of the Jew in through Zionism, the
Sure.
muscular super Jew.
Siegel and Schuster, I remember I read an interview where both they were talking about their inspiration for Superman, and one or the other said that Tarzan, Burne Hogarth, was one of their idols.
Hmm.
In some ways, when you look at Superman, it's Tarzan with a cape.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, anyway. Okay, we'll figure it all out eventually. Maybe not in our lifetime. But no, it is fascinating. But we see, I mean, before the meeting, we were talking a little bit about blacklisting today and how people are being tarred as anti-Semitic for maybe saying something. I mean, there's no organized. They're not in the Nazi Party, but we're seeing even these hearings, these Senate hearings with university professors. It's just it's a rerun of history. I don't know.
Sure. The abuse of power. Yeah.
I think young academics are like scared to say anything. I mean, they just don't. You can really jeopardize your job pretty quickly.
Well, that's going on. I mean, I do teaching here and have taught at a private high school here, and a lot of these teachers, they're living in fear of being accused of saying the wrong thing.
The right thing. I don't know
what or being faulted for saying the right thing. Exactly.
Yeah, it's people wonder how these things even could happen, but there's not much pushback in the Senate against these hearings. They go on. I think they may be. I don't know if they're over. I don't know,
but they're ongoing.
And there were also this magazine that you mentioned that this guy Kilpatrick was publishing. I mean,
Counterattack, yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole equivalent of the
online
of that going on.
Online, yeah. It's proliferated enormously.
All kinds of organizations hunting down crypto anti-Semites. So it's anyway, but
I'm sure that Burne would be appalled at what's going on now.
Yeah, and I mean, unless he thought it would jeopardize his school, maybe then he would just,
Well, I mean, the thing is with those hearings, and I'm sure he was counseled by his attorney, it didn't matter what he said. That those hearings were designed for one thing and one thing only. They're not trying to do anybody a favor or clear up anything. The Red Scare was what it was. They were just trying to tar and feather people, or to accuse them or ruin them for being anything but a conservative Republican. And that's largely what's going on now. You've seen these university presidents lose their job, and that's all because they didn't forcefully say what they wanted them to say, but they said what was actually correct, which is it depends on the context whether you condemn something. And the context is correct about, well, when and how did they say this? Because their policies actually say that. Their official policies, and that's what they were answering in line with. So, I mean, those committee, what's her name? Stefanik, who was heading that committee. They're only there for one reason. They're just trying to ruin somebody. They're trying to shame or humiliate or degrade or whatever it is. And McCarthy was doing the same thing. It was, for them, it's all just for fun. It's a game to them. McCarthy, he used to express surprise when any of those witnesses outside of the hearing room would curse at him or tell him, fuck off. He didn't understand. For him, it was all a show.
Yeah. I think Burne would be appalled at the diminution of academic freedom today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he might very well lose his job now for being too loud.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. They would fire him because you're scaring the students.
Yeah. He wouldn't last more than about 10 minutes.
Yeah. So was that, I know it's beyond the scope of your research, but was that the partner already, Silas Rhodes, or were there other partners?
No. Silas was always the partner. He met him. Silas was teaching an English class at the Robert Louis Stevenson School with 4 people in it, and Silas also changed his name. His real name is Seymour Harvey Rosenbluth.
Jesus Christ.
That's Silas's real name. He'd been in the service during the war in the Army Air Corps as a technical sergeant. But at any rate, he'd gotten his degree in English, I think, before the war. Anyway, he was teaching a course at the Robert Louis Stevenson School, and Burne came over there, and they gave him a couple of rooms, and he had them both full. He had, 10 or 12 people in 2 rooms, and he would run from one room to the other. He would give one room an assignment to draw. They'd start working on it. He'd go to the other room, give them an assignment. They'd start drawing. Then he'd run back to the other room to look at what the other people were working on and evaluate their work. And he was just running between rooms doing this. And Silas saw this and was like, holy crap, who is this guy? I need to get hooked up with him because, he's going somewhere. And so he approached him and said, we should make a formal school with this, because Silas had worked with the VA. And he says, I know how to get GI Bill money so that we can bring more GIs in and build this thing. And Burne thought, yeah, let's do that. He wanted to legitimize it and grow it. And so that's what they did.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I'm going to run.
Okay. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Gary. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
Thank everybody for
Thanks for
coming.